This is no longer an election. This is like Alice in Wonderland. I mean, we just get stranger and stranger.
Well, it's total confusion. I mean, it's complete confusion.
Good grief, look at that.
11, that means automatic recount.
So at one stage, you got NBC declaring George Bush the president, and you got Al Gore calling George Bush and conceding the presidency. But that was the moment that was to unravel. And then we're in the battle for Florida. The year is 2000, and George Bush and Al Gore are fighting an American presidential election which will eventually take 6 weeks to decide and only be decided by a margin of 537 votes. The campaign up to election day had been pretty standard for American campaigns. On the one hand, we'd had Al Gore very much in the center of the Democratic Party, much like the then sitting president, Bill Clinton, but with this extra tinge that Gore had of environmentalism, of the green issues that he was so fond of. We're beginning, as we went into the new century, we're beginning to get some traction. And on the other hand, we had George Bush, who had very typically American conservative values about spending and taxation and that sort of thing, but with an added tinge himself, which was this idea of compassionate conservatism. Well, the Republicans felt they had the edge, and they exhibited this by going to campaign in states beyond the actual swing states that most people had identified as the ones that were key to victory. So as election day approached, they were looking to expand the map, to get more states. The Democrats, meanwhile, were equally fairly confident about it. It always looked like it was going to be close. Bill Clinton had left a very, very healthy economy. We had 8 solid years of growth. So I think everybody expected it to be fairly close, though not as close as it turned out to be. And I was the executive producer for the Sky News US election coverage in 2000, based in Washington, DC. So on election night, an American newsroom on election night is largely a question of everybody looking at everybody else, because American elections are called by the networks. The networks get the results in from an organization called the Voter News Service, which counts real results and matches them against expectations and exit polling. And what we were doing is that we had a live point in the Hay Adams Hotel, which directly overlooks the White House from Lafayette Square. So we'd taken the frame out of a window in the hotel out and put our anchor in the window with a shot directly looking over the floodlit White House. And his job was to report what the American networks were saying as the results came in. And my job as the executive producer was literally to lie on the hotel bed beneath the camera and flick the channels on the TV so he could see what the American networks were reporting. And believe me, it was complete chaos. And I vividly remember Pennsylvania, then regarded as an absolutely key state, a key pathway to the presidency, as it is this time, being called for Al Gore. And that was seen very much as the state that you had to win if you were going to win the presidency. And the other one, of course, was Florida, and everybody was waiting on Florida to be called. What happened in Florida is that CNN called Florida before the polls had actually closed in the whole of the state. And that's because part of the state of Florida, the panhandle in the west of the state, is on a different time zone. And that was the moment when everybody thought Gore had won the presidency, but that was the moment that was to unravel. So what had happened was that the lead that Gore had in Florida was slightly false because it wasn't counting these Republican votes in the west of the state. And this became apparent soon. And so the other networks, who largely followed CNN in calling it for Gore, suddenly thought, this doesn't look right, and we're going to put this state back into what they call toss-up. Either side could win. Subsequently, as the evening went on, it looked even better for Bush, and so the state was put into Bush win. So at one stage, you got NBC calling Florida for George Bush now, out of toss-up state, and for George Bush, and giving him enough electoral college votes to win the presidency. And you got Al Gore calling George Bush and conceding the presidency. But then what happens is that actually people start looking at the tally of the votes and seeing it's actually too close even to call it for George Bush. The numbers come down and down and down. And in the end, it becomes apparent that there's going to have to be a mandatory recount in Florida because the difference between the Bush tally and the Gore tally is so low. And Gore retracts his concession to George Bush. So when, as a British broadcaster, when the American broadcasters can't tell you who's won, well, we're in completely in the dark because we don't even have the same access to the same data that they do. The whole process of us reporting what the Americans are saying was complete chaos in this small hotel room overlooking the White House. And then we're in the battle for Florida.
So the Democrats, as they keep touching the ballots, maybe like when Jesus broke the bread and fed 5,000, they'll touch the ballots and make more. I'm afraid of them people making more out of nothing.
Well, the first thing we had to do was get everybody down to Florida, because Florida was where the action was. As soon as the machine recount had taken place, it was clear that the Democrats were going to challenge the results of the machine recount, which still gave Bush a few hundred vote advantage, and call for hand recounts in certain counties. The Democrats pushing all the time for recounts, manual recounts to continue, and the Republicans pushing all the time for the recounts to be halted for as long as their candidate stayed in the race. And the Republicans were desperate to stop the count as soon as they can. So they sent down Republican operatives. There was an event known as the Brooke Brothers riot. Brooke Brothers, a famous chain in America where sells suits and things, and sort of suits that Republican operatives wear, and all these white Brooke Brothers dressed suited guys came down to Florida and protested outside the count in Miami-Dade County, which was one of the counties which the Democrats were pushing to get recounted because it had a large African American and Hispanic population, and therefore one that would likely yield more Democrat votes in a recount. So there was masses going on all the time. If you add to that all this confusion over the ballots themselves and what became known as hanging chads, Florida had all over Florida, there were different ways of voting, and some of them used these 1950s machines that punched out holes in the ballot paper. Whether the punch had gone through properly, or whether the little bit of paper that was against the candidate's name had been severed properly or was just hanging there, became known as the hanging chads. And the number of hanging chads was reported each day. And then there were pregnant chads, which were little dimples in the ballot paper that had been made with the punch but hadn't actually gone through the ballot paper. And the whole thing sort of generated a whole new language of electoral law and electoral coverage that none of us had ever known before. It was absolutely complete chaos, and I must admit, as an outsider, as a Brit, it was fairly hard to follow. But the essentials of the race, I think, were quite simple. Bush was a few hundred ahead. The Democrats wanted to continue counting. The Republicans wanted to stop them counting. But we're up against the certification deadline in mid-December. And the Republicans take it to the Supreme Court of Florida and say, look, we're too close to the deadline. We'll never get this counting done. We've got to shut it off now. And the Supreme Court of Florida said, no, the counting should continue. So then the Republicans appealed to the United States Supreme Court. And that was at the point where the count was halted. The Supreme Court, by a 5-4 majority, said, no, you've got to stop the count now, otherwise it won't be certified in time for the Electoral College. The clock freezes now, and it froze with George Bush a few hundred votes ahead.
The peaceful transfer of authority is rare in history, yet common in our country.
So in hindsight, I see the 2000 election fight, if you like, over the ballots in Florida as very much a precursor to what we've seen, particularly in the Trump years since. In one sense, we saw direct action in people trying to stop vote counting. We saw that obviously in 2020, and we saw it in 2000, where people were going along, and this idea of stopping the steal or keep the count going and all that sort of thing that we very much saw in the 2020 election was there really for the first time. People outside counts, people potentially intimidating counters, people needing to secure ballot boxes and counters away from the crowds of people that were trying to influence the count. We see just the sort of the seeds of the sort of passions and the sort of attempts to change the course of the democratic process that we saw on January 6th in 2021. So that's one thing. And the second thing I think we see is just the degree to which litigation has become part of the American electoral process. Now, of course, litigation was always part of the American electoral process, but at every single step in the 2000 election, we saw high-paid lawyers intervening to tilt the election in their favour, to, if you like, prevent the certification, to prevent what had previously been thought of as established rules just running their course. And that obviously is something that we see all the time now. We even see it being preempted in the current election campaign. So I think very much you see 2024 reflected in 2020. And of course, the other thing that has become one of the great themes of American politics since 2000 is that 2000 was the first time since 1888 that an American president had been elected while losing the national popular vote. That's the vote across the entire country. And of course, we saw it again in 2016. When Trump won in 2016, he lost the popular vote to Hillary Clinton, but won in the Electoral College. And we're very likely, if Trump wins this time round, to see it again, with Trump winning in the Electoral College, but losing the popular vote across the country. So that asks real questions about the legitimacy of American democracy. And I think we see those questions first really being asked, those questions about how fair is the Electoral College in a true democratic process, being asked back in the year 2000. So many parallels, I think, between 2000 and 2024.